Whether you clicked on this video because you're interested in learning more about the Lithuanians, you're interested in the thumbnail, or you're a native Lithuanian who wants to make sure this American gets his facts correct about your country, let me assure you, we're all going to be learning something new about the Lithuanians today. Food is arguably the most important resource in Age of Empires 2, but all we see in game is just a single set of numbers. Throughout this series, we will be diving in to see exactly what foods each civilization prepared and ate, and how well I can recreate them. This is Meals of Empires. Lithuanian medieval cuisine is quite similar to that of the Poles and the Slavs that we've already touched on in this series. The Lithuanian civilization began as just a loose group of chiefdoms or tribes that were coming together to repel the Viking and Rus invasions or raids. And then slowly, around the 1200s, that actually formed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And that's really when the feudal agricultural system started to be built up, where instead of doing a lot, well, we'll touch on that in a little bit once we get to the actual recipe. But in terms of grains, we've seen a lot of rye, including this rye bread. We mentioned it when we did the Poles last week, but we didn't actually show the cooking process. We just had it ready available. And this week we'll actually be touching on this, as well as some pickled or spiced cabbage and a lentil soup. Let's get started with the cooking. There are quite a few steps in bread making, so we're going to be jumping in between quite a few steps. The first step, though, is going to be to make our levain, or our starter. I have my sourdough starter here. This is actually a mix of wheat flour, water, and the sourdough cultures that have inoculated this over time. We're going to start with 60 grams of our levain. There we go, 67 grams. I'm going to call that close enough. Modern bread making is as close to chemistry as you can get while still being allowed to eat the final product. I have to imagine medieval bread making was a little bit more based off feel. To that, we're going to add 30 grams of rye flour. And now we'll add 30 grams of filtered water. In the medieval times, this would probably just be spring water. And for me, since I don't have a filter, I'm just boiling the water to get most of the chlorine out. We can mix this up and set it aside for now, and the yeast cultures will begin to break down the food that's in there, the carbohydrates, and start expanding their population, start that rise that will eventually help give our bread some rise. This next step is going to be starting our pickled or spiced cabbage. I think pickled is not exactly the right way to describe it. That's how it's described in the Königsberg recipe. So I'm going to take my 2 halves of my cabbage. This is the spiral cabbage. That's the Dutch variety, but it's very similar in taste and flavor to any other cabbage. And just try to boil it whole for about 30 minutes. So we're going to pretend that our starter has been rising for 3 to 4 hours now at around 70 degrees, but then we can start mixing the rest of our ingredients. We're going to start with 250 grams of rye flour. We're adding 185 grams or milliliters of our filtered water. And the last item that I'm not really measuring is the amount of honey. Honey, I feel like, is a good additive to give the sourdough something to feed on. Honey, of course, debatable on whether it's vegan. Some people say yes, many people say no. And there are many alternatives, such as agave nectar, that you could put in instead of honey. This makes a dough that's around like 75% hydration. Rye flour, I think, can take a slightly higher percentage because it absorbs a bit more water than a wheat flour might. Having a 100%, so equal amount of water and flour, can be a bit difficult for new bakers to deal with. So I think this 75% is pretty easy to manage, I would say, because you'll see it's already very sticky. We're also going to hold off on adding the salt just for a little bit until we add the rest of the ferment. Autolysing is the process of the water fully getting into the rye flour and hydrating it completely. But at this point, normally in the baking process, this would have been going on for 4 hours. And we let it go for maybe another 30 minutes while the dough autolyzes as well. Trivia question number 1, while we wait for our cabbage to cook. What is the name of the large shield that the Lithuanians carried into battle? If you need an idea, it's the shield that's in the icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Is it A, rook, B, a pavis, C, a hill fort, or D, a buckler? MT has the correct answer. You're right as well, thinking that the pavise are mostly being used by the Italians. The Lithuanian infantry carried a large wooden shield called a tower shield or a pavise. They're slightly different, but in Age of Empires 2, the technology pavise was given to the Italians, as Genoese mercenaries are known to have hidden behind these large shields while reloading their crossbows. So it's almost like just a big plank of wood, like a massive cutting board that they would just put right in front of them, and they could hide behind it while they took the time to reload their crossbow. In comparison, a tower shield is rounded like a barrel, and so you could be holding it and be rounded, and so the center of weight is a little bit further behind your hand, so it's not like pulling you forward. It's a little bit easier to carry in that regard. And the Lithuanian coat of arms, which is what's in the bottom left-hand corner, is called the Pillars of Gediminas, and it's represented on the shields and the coins from the late medieval period. And it's thought that the symbol represents one of the gates to a castle in Trakai, near the medieval and modern capitals of Lithuania. While we wait for the cabbage to finish cooking, we can get started on our aromatics for the lentil soup. We're going to be doing onion and garlic, pretty typical combination, and was present in the recipes from the time period. Lithuanians really started as a civilization in the 1200s. 1236 is the date given on Wikipedia. So very late in the medieval period, though their empire kind of lasted a little bit longer than a lot of other empires. It was almost like the climate was delaying them. Before that, it was a lot of slash and burn practices where you cut up a forest, you burn what remains, and you till it into the soil repeatedly with a plow. You use that field for maybe 6 to 8 years, and then you just kind of abandon it and move on. So it was more of like having a homestead. Garlic next, we'll do our standard 4 cloves. The first and only king of Lithuania was Mindaugas. He eventually just got assassinated by the Lithuanian people, who were very much against Christianity at the time. And the war and crusade with the Teutonic Order lasted from the 1200s up to 1377, up until the marriage of Jogaila to Jadwiga. We'll call that good on the cabbage to spend about 30 minutes. The water it's been cooking in is full of flavor. And if you think of a Lithuanian family who's cooking a meal, they don't have a full harvest of grains in yet, so they don't want to be wasting any extra food, so to speak. So we're going to reuse this broth to flavor our lentil stew. We're going to start in this pot once we get the cabbage out. So the next step for this cabbage is going to be to pickle it or spice it up with some other ingredients. This is typically served cold, and for that reason, I'm going to put this in an ice bath for right now. But if you're just going to prepare this ahead of time, make the sauce, combine the ingredients together first, and then you can put it in the fridge to let it cool down over time. Just chill out. So we can go back to our rye bread and work on our ferment and mix it in with the rest of our ingredients. And if you're a fan of not kneading your dough, then rye bread might be the bread for you. Since rye bread doesn't have many of those gluten proteins present, there's not as much of a need or even a function of trying to knead all that dough together to get those proteins to form in whatever patterns you want. We want this lighter bit and the darker bit to all be combined together, and that's really all the kneading we're going to be doing for this dough. I do have another mixed dough ball ready in the oven. So here we have the rye flour versus what's been being used as an example, which is the whole wheat flour over here, just because I ran out of rye flour and I couldn't find any more in any of the grocery stores I went to today. You might see that the metal bowl with the rye flour is a little bit darker than what we were using as an example with the whole wheat flour. So for me, it's more of a case of shaping the dough. You can see there's still some splitting on the bottom here on this loaf. We're going to quickly saute our onions and our garlic at the start of our lentil soup. Lard, as I mentioned with the Poles, would be the most common oil or fat used in any type of sauteing or frying. Instead, we're going to be using olive oil. We're going to let this saute for about 6 minutes first before we add the garlic. Second trivia question. Given that threshing is the process of removing grain from the attached straw, what does the architectural term threshold derive from? How is processing a grain related to the entrance of a home. I like the idea of it being shoe related because a lot of the time they would be stepping on grains to help break them down. The threshing would typically have occurred on a flat place, and it might be the grain spread out on the ground and you're hitting it with a stick, or maybe you have oxen that are trampling it to help separate the grain from the chaff. And all the time that's in a flat space, but it could also be in a barn. And you might have bits or wind flowing through the barn. So to prevent the grain from leaving the barn, the space, the threshing floor, so to speak, you might put up a piece of wood at the front of the door, just at the bottom, to keep the grain from falling out. And the name threshold, which originally referred to the bottom of the threshing space, like say in a barn, eventually moved to this piece of wood that was right at the entrance, and that became the threshold. That's at least one hypothesis on how that name came about, and it makes pretty good sense to me. The lentils I'll be using are green lentils. I try to look up how the different lentils that we know today, like green lentils, red lentils, kind of diverged throughout Europe, what arrived to which location first, what the genetics were doing during that time period, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet. We're going to be adding a cup of lentils, or about 250 milliliters. All of our cabbage broth going right back in. So we're going to say this has been rising for 4 hours, or maybe even overnight. Maybe in your Lithuanian house, you just had built the bread up a little bit during the nighttime before you went to sleep. You just left it in a container covered, and then you just maybe folded it over as you woke up before you put it in the oven for the day. And so because this is very sticky, now I'm using my hands. Instead of just using dry hands, I'm going to use wet hands, which can kind of help a little bit. The rye flour is almost muddy. Like it's almost like a clay mask that you might put on your hands. It's definitely different than when you handle wheat flour. So I'm just going to try to flip this over the best I can. And we'll do it again a little bit with the sides. But it is tricky. I'd recommend just trying to be as gentle as possible with it because it doesn't really want to stick together. There's our baking tray. I'm going to take the rye dough and I'm actually going to flip it upside down for where it's going to be on the baking tray. I'm just trying to get my hand underneath to support it. Try to get as much of the dough as possible. I didn't do a superbly great job. And I'm going to just try to fold it all over it back onto itself. Loaf is in the oven at 220 degrees Celsius, which is around 430 degrees Fahrenheit, and will be cooking for about an hour. So we have plenty of time to do our last trivia question. If you call this a finger, and you call these three fingers, what do you call just two? So the point of this question is there's not a great answer in English. I recommend we call this a finger, this fingi, and these fingers. But the point is, in Old Lithuanian, you had a different word for the duality, or when you have a couplet of things. So my example, that might not be 100% correct, just that little caveat there. In Old Lithuanian, you could have vienas pirstas, du pirstu, and tris pirstai. So in modern Lithuanian, the pirst, the start of the word, is your word for finger. Vienas meaning one finger, du, and it would be pirstai, the AI being the ending for multiple. And I'm thinking Old Lithuanian might have had a U sound at the end there, but the duality in Old Lithuanian and a lot of other languages has fallen out over time. And it's easier just to have a word to say two of something, like couple or couplet, rather than giving every single word a different variation. It might just be like a new ending, but like say you saw two emus, but you were trying to put a U at the end of the word when you're just saying you saw two of them. So you'd say two emu, and then people were like, "You okay there, bud? You're kind of weird." Emu. The Iliad, supposedly told by Homer, could have been written by multiple people because in ancient Greek you sometimes have the duality used, and in some cases it's not being used. So I'm guessing that the duality might have actually come from ancient Greek because a lot of Slavic script is influenced to some extent by ancient Greek. For our spicy cabbage sauce, aka the pickled cabbage sauce. This is coming from the Königsberg manuscript, so the same manuscript that we used for the Lent sausage recipe. Boil white cabbage heads, take 2 parts mustard and 1 part honey, mix them with wine and add caraway. Mix it enough, put the boiled cabbage into it, and serve it cold. You can also season the broth and serve it. Starting from the top, 2 parts mustard, 1 part honey. We're just saying 2 tablespoons of mustard, 1 tablespoon of honey. Mix them with wine and add caraway. No clear amounts there, so I'm going to say 30 grams of wine. I think that should be enough to allow all the flavors to permeate the cabbage. So I think we're being fairly accurate to this original recipe. So we're doing 2 tablespoons of mustard, and this is our Groninger mustard that we had in the episode for the Burgundians for our mustard soup. And it is quite spicy. Again, you could use agave nectar as a vegan replacement, but honey in Europe doesn't bother me all that much since the species are at least native. So this should be about 50 milliliters. We'll take a look at it. This is just a standard red wine. Wine does not grow very well in Lithuania, so this would have had to arrive from the south or maybe from trade routes coming into the Baltics. Caraway seeds are, as I mentioned, in pumpernickel breads, though I don't know how much of a flavor they have. It might just be a smell rather than a taste that comes through. Like the acidity from both the mustard and the wine it's already putting me on edge. That might just be because I haven't had anything to eat. See how evenly I can pour this out over all of our cabbage. Our lentils have softened up after about 30 minutes of cooking, and we'll just keep cooking them a little bit longer. You can see they filled in this soup quite well. I think I'm going to add maybe another cup of water. Last step in our prep is to slice open our rye bread that was cooked earlier before the stream. The bread that's cooking right now is going to take a while to set. Some air pockets have still opened. This is, I think, as good as you can get rye bread because it just doesn't expand as much. It doesn't have the gluten to hold things together. But you might find some that are slightly less dense out there as well. This is the one that we made earlier. You can see the one made earlier rose a little bit more, but it shows you at least the variation you can expect in the bread. All right, our taste tester is back. Thank you, Abby, for coming back after your break last week. We have today our Lithuanian meal with a lentil soup with a cabbage broth. The cabbage broth came from the cabbage that's here on the right side or left for you guys watching. It was boiled, and then a sauce of 2 parts mustard, 1 part honey, 50 mils of wine, red wine, and then some rye bread to finish it all off.
Very savory.
As in I added too much salt?
No, it almost tastes like beef broth.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Which I don't like that much.
Okay. I think that would be more the lentil flavor, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, it's like,
because I don't have experience myself.
It's very hearty.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's all cabbage. The little bits are just like the parts of the ground mustard and some caraway seeds. Too mustardy?
No.
Too spicy?
It was bad in a way that I couldn't have expected.
It's a wild recipe. I was reading some of those other recipes that on stream that are in the manuscript, and some of them are just crazy. But it's the same manuscript that gave us our Lent sausage last week that you gave an A+, I believe.
It smells like beef jerky.
I don't know beef jerky that well, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Do you? Because
there's like a little bit of a maltiness to it. And now you're putting it what you consider to be the beef broth soup.
I'm putting the beef jerky into the beef broth soup.
What do you think of the texture of the bread? A little bit like chewy?
A little chewy.
Because it's not like rising as much as a wheat flour. And it's a little sticky too.
Yeah, it almost feels like it needs more cooking.
Mm-hmm. Could be, because it is so dense.
It's very airy. Yeah, it's dense. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Execution score.
It was supposed to be pickled, right? Like it was supposed to be originally pickled?
The translation is pickled, but that's pretty much exactly the recipe.
Ah, okay.
So I call it spicy because it's not your traditional pickled.
Truly pickled.
It's not fermented, exactly.
Yeah. Sure, they made soup like this before.
Mm-hmm. Soup is said to be like very, I would say, more common in Lithuanian culture than in other cultures.
I feel like maybe 6 is like, it's going to be a 7.
7 on execution.
Yeah, 7 and 4.
And a 4 on should you serve this to your girlfriend. Okay, I think that's apt. I mean, that's roughly what I was expecting, given what I've already done, because I don't want to overlap with the other foods. I would say some of the other foods are a little bit more interesting. Abby mentioned that the lentil soup tastes like beef broth, but again, I grew up pescatarian, went vegan when I was in high school, have very little experience with beef. Mainly taste of lentils. There's a little bit of cabbage flavor, and it is just savory, as Abby put. The rye bread is very chewy. It's arguably better used as a cracker. The cabbage is cooked pretty well, maybe a little bit too well done. Will I finish this? Yes. But will I really want to ever make this again? No. Just adding mustard to what is otherwise a salad in this amount, along with wine too, right? Like, it's not even wine that's being cooked off. I understand wine being used because you're not drinking as much water when you can't purify it. In the medieval times, that's why you had just a lot of watered down ale and wine. Next week will be the Bengalis. We might have some eggplant, we might have some rice, we might have a ton of vegetables and a ton of different spices. So subscribe if you want to be notified when that video comes out. Like, throw the video to some of your friends, share it to them. Maybe they'll be interested in cooking a meal for you. Who knows what might happen? Until then, I'll see you in the comments.